Okay, off we go. Hello, folks. Welcome to another SACPA session. SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the lands of the Blackfoot people and Métis Nations of Alberta Region 3, and we pay respect to their past, present, and future cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. SACPA commits to assist reconciliation efforts by raising awareness of the ways past and present injustices can be reconciled. SACPA is thankful for the continuing support we receive from the University of Lethbridge, Shaw Spotlight, and the Lethbridge Herald. Today, we're very happy to have with us Jacqueline Peterson, who will be talking about the provincial cuts and the municipal impacts of those cuts. Jacqueline Peterson received her PhD from the University of Toronto in political science in 2020. An expert in municipal finance, her research focuses on multi-level governance, local finance, and urban governance in Canada and the US. Jacqueline frequently teaches urban politics and policy at the University of Calgary as a sessional instructor. Her forthcoming book, Multi-Level Fiscal Institutions and the Politics of Funding Sustainable Urban Infrastructure, will be published in 2022 by McGill Queen's University Press. Prior to entering academia, Jacqueline worked for elected representatives in both Calgary City's Council and the Alberta Legislature. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very delighted to have you with us, and we very much look forward to your talk.
Great. Thanks, Annalise. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be here today. I'm joining you actually from just up the road in Brooks. So I want to give a big thank you to SACPA for inviting me to be here today and organizing this event. I'm delighted to be here with you all to discuss my latest research on municipal provincial relations, which was published in September by the Parkland Institute at the University of Alberta. So the report itself is titled An Unfair Deal: The Impact of Provincial Cuts on Alberta's Municipalities. So today I'll be providing some of the high-level takeaways of the report. As is always the case, there's a lot more detail in the report itself, which we'll be going into today, and I encourage you all to read and circulate and find online. So we wanted to publish this report in advance of the municipal elections that, as you're all well aware, took place across the province this year in October. So it was our hope to help voters make more informed decisions at the ballot box and understand many of the complexities involved in local governance. We were compelled to write this report and release it in advance of Alberta's municipal elections because, quite frankly, cities matter. And I mean, I'm going to actually start off our talk here today with a little bit of a thought experiment. I'm going to ask you, what have you done already today? I know many of you will think, well, I haven't really done much, but I ask you, have you had a shower? Flushed the toilet, made some coffee by plugging in your machine into the electricity? I mean, you're all using electricity now. Did you drive anywhere, walk on a sidewalk, stop at a traffic light? Did you take your garbage out to the curb? These are all very day-to-day simple things that really define our lives and our quality of lives. They're often things we just take for granted. But these are really distinctly municipal local services and municipal infrastructure that we use on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we also, of course, use provincial and federal services. I mean, I was listening to CBC this morning and, dropped my son off at a provincial school. But by and large, municipal services, municipal infrastructure really builds the foundations, I believe, of our lives. So with that, cities matter. municipal elections matter, and the outcomes of these elections have very direct and meaningful consequences on our everyday lives, on the quality and breadth of city services, our tax rates, local jobs, local economy, truly what the future of our cities will look like. But these municipal decisions aren't made by local councils alone. So in fact, provincial policy has direct and very meaningful impacts on the options available to local governments. And, while many people recognize the role that your local city councils and mayors may have on the changes you see in your cities, I would say much of the public is generally unaware of the critical role played by the province in shaping these decisions. So this is what this report and my talk here today really tries to do. Highlight to voters and residents the very real way that provincial policy, and most notably recent budgetary decisions made by the current UCP government, influence local available to cities. So today I'll be going over some of the key findings of this report. And next slide, please. So municipal finance, dare I say, is not exactly the sexiest of public policy issues. I don't think it's a coincidence that people generally don't spend too much time writing their MLAs or losing sleep on the topic, because municipal finance and budgeting is complex, nuanced, lots of different players. It's hard to wrap your head around. So it's going to be my job here today to change how you think about municipal finance as a distinctly provincial policy area, and get you excited or at least interested about the real world impacts these policy decisions have on your day-to-day lives. So over the past spring and summer of this year, I interviewed municipal leaders across Alberta, councillors, mayors, city employees of cities and towns of all different sizes, on the specific impacts provincial policy has in their communities, focusing particularly on the province's impact on local finances. So this can really take two forms. The province impacts municipal finances through grants and transfer programs, essentially by the payments it sends to municipalities. But the province also impacts municipal finance because it sets the rules on local taxes, fines, revenue, how cities can generate revenue. The rules by which cities can generate revenue are essentially set by the province. And there was really one clear message that was reiterated over and over throughout these interviews, and that is that specifically over the past few years, cities, towns, rural municipalities across Alberta have really been squeezed, which has reduced several sources. The province has reduced several sources of revenue that cities and towns have traditionally relied upon. And this has very implications for local infrastructure, what cities can build, as well as local services and day-to-day operations. So next slide. Before I get into some of the specifics, I just want to take a minute on this point and really clearly differentiate between municipal capital budgets and operating budgets. So cities usually think of their budgets separately, right? Capital budgets involve infrastructure or the city's kind of physical assets, right? Roads, sewers, a new fire hall, new buses. These expenses are often paid for by a mix of intergovernmental grants, developer levies, and also a city's own source revenue like tax revenue. Operating budgets, on the other hand, are the programs and services that municipalities provide on a day-to-day basis. So this could be things like fire and police response, 311 services, basic road maintenance, snow clearing. Luckily, no snow clearing today. Bus drivers, planning, citizen engagement, these sorts of things were all covered in a city's general or operating budget. And these types of expenses are largely paid for by local residents, especially through property taxes and user fees. So of course they do impact one another in some ways, but they're often considered separate from one another. And municipalities do treat these two areas separately when making budgetary decisions. And I mean, I know many of you are probably well aware of these differences, but they're especially important to understand when talking about municipal finances and the province's impact on municipalities. And here, I mean, I've inserted a graph that shows, of all the transfers that were sent to the city of Lethbridge in 2019, it shows how the majority of them are for the capital expenditures. Okay, so this is where I'm going to begin my discussion. I'm going to kind of break it into looking first at capital, then at operating. So we can move to the next slide, if you don't mind. Thank you. So I'll start by looking at the province's impact on municipal infrastructure or cities' capital budgets, especially because this is the area that receives most provincial funding. So the most recent 2021 provincial budget outlines some significant decreases in infrastructure funding to Alberta's municipalities over the next several years. So the Municipal Sustainability Initiative, or as we call it in municipal finance, MSI, is the province's largest capital grant program to municipalities. Municipalities have really relied extensively on this fund over the past several years. It was originally conceived as a 10-year, $11.3 billion program, right? A lot of money. However, in the latest budget, the MSI program is not only being cut by $330 million, but the funding is also being drawn out 2 years longer than was originally anticipated. And just to put this into context, one of the people I interviewed, councillor, now mayor of Calgary, Jody Gondek, compared it to, telling your kid that they would be receiving a $20 allowance once a week, right? And then on Friday, parents come to the kid and say, you know what, we're actually going to make that $18 and we're not going to give it to you until sometime next week, right? So all of a sudden, the child will have to put off what they originally were intending to buy, ultimately has less purchasing power. Okay, so under the previous government, the NDP government, the MSI was set to be replaced in 2022 with what was called the City Charters Fiscal Framework. Okay, and this was an agreement between the province and its two largest cities, Calgary and Edmonton, that really recognized the larger responsibilities, capacities that are really evolving in nature for Alberta's largest cities and their need for a more stable, reliable revenue source. And the City Charter's fiscal framework included a revenue sharing component in it. And I mean, it should also be noted that while this City Charter's fiscal framework was finalized in 2018, discussions for this had began years previously under previous PC governments. So the need for such an arrangement and rethinking municipal revenue sources has really been on the government's radar for a long time. Okay. However, in 2019, the UCP shelved the City Charters framework and replaced it instead with what they call the local government fiscal framework, which is now set to begin in 2024. Okay. So not only does the LGFF, this new framework, provide cities with a lower base annual funding. So originally it was supposed to be $860 million a year, and now it's $722 million a year. But also the revenue sharing component of this framework is substantially reduced. Okay. And I mean, just to put, so when we're talking about the MSI being cut $330 million, just to put this into context, I mean, I don't have the data for Lethbridge, but Medicine Hats, which I assume is somewhat comparable, its entire capital budget for 2021 was $25 million. Okay, so that's 10% of 330. If we think about Edmonton's entire road maintenance budget, so this includes all the maintenance they do on the city's 10,000 kilometers of roads, it's 160 bridges, 113,000 streetlights, interchanges, sidewalks. This is less than 100 million a year, right? So this is all to say that 330 million is a lot of money that can go towards a lot of things. And ultimately, when you decrease infrastructure funding, municipalities are having to delay critical infrastructure projects, some of them even indefinitely, right? And it's kind of the same as the allowance analogy. If you're getting less than what you're expecting and over a longer period of time, you're going to have to cut back on your expectations on what you can do with it. And so right now, when cities are getting squeezed on the infrastructure front, of course, their priorities are for their immediate concerns, right? So fixing infrastructure, doing significant repairs on infrastructure that's already there. And they have less capacity to be thinking about the infrastructure that they need to be making as a future investment, right? The infrastructure that's going to help attract talent, families, investment to municipalities, that the investments that will allow cities to grow more sustainably and thoughtfully, because these benefits will really be realized further down the road, right? And it's these types of investments that I personally worry the most about, especially as we try to attract residents that can literally live anywhere in the world, right? All right, next slide. Okay, so well, the cuts to infrastructure spending has been the largest and most visible. The province has also taken a number of measures that impact local operating revenues, or the revenues cities rely on to provide day-to-day services. One of these policy changes that was really highlighted in my interviews were decreases in the municipality's share of police fine revenue. So whenever you get a ticket or pay a fine to the police, this revenue is actually shared between the province and municipalities. In the past, municipalities used to retain 73% of fine revenue, and this has now decreased to 60%, which has resulted in a net loss of $37 million. Typically, this money has been earmarked for police budgets, right? So the police, municipal police forces are feeling especially pinched, and having to face deeper cuts as a result of these policy decisions. So again, this is an example, not necessarily of a decreased transfer. It's not the province cutting back the payments it's giving, but it's changing the rules by which revenue is generated. And then this impacts cities' revenue generating capabilities. So another big issue that was raised was a decrease in payments through a program called Grants in Place of Taxes. This program is essentially how the province pays its property tax to municipalities. Okay, so the province doesn't pay property tax the same that we do. Instead, they have this program in place that basically reimburses cities for the services they provide to provincial buildings, right? So these funds are meant to pay for streets to be cleared in front of provincial properties, fire, police response, if that was ever needed, sidewalks in front, nearby parks. I mean, the list goes on. So this program, the Grants in Place of Taxes program, decreased from close to 58 million in 2018 It was almost halved to 30 million in 2021. Okay, so when the province doesn't adequately cover these basic municipal services and pay its share of property taxes, it falls on municipal taxpayers to pick up the tab, essentially. I mean, this is something that irked mayors and city observers of all stripes that I interviewed, regardless of their, political inclinations. And this actually has a particular impact on Lethbridge. So next slide, and I'll get into that. So Lethbridge provides an especially interesting case in point on this front. So the city of Lethbridge, like many other mid-sized cities in Alberta, is facing tighter budgets as a result of these provincial policy decisions. So Lethbridge has the most nursing homes per capita in Alberta. I don't know how many of you are aware of that. The province recently made the decision to make these facilities tax exempt, so they no longer have to pay property taxes to municipalities. Okay. So this decision was made at the same time that these grants in place of taxes transfers to municipalities were reduced, right? And again, these transfers are intended to allow cities to compensate, allow the province to compensate cities for providing basic municipal services, right, to provincial properties, given that the government of Alberta doesn't pay municipal property taxes. So the city of Lethbridge received just over $500,000 less in transfers from this program from the province in 2020 compared to 2018, even though the city is now servicing more properties that are not paying property taxes, right? And this has resulted in close to $1 million budget or revenue shortfall. So, and also if you think about it, like many of Lethbridge's retirement homes are in desirable locations, close to parks, amenities. So although residents benefit from a range of municipal services, the province is not fully compensating the city for these services. So this not only squeezes the city's budget, but it really places the tax burden more on other property taxpayers as well. So again, however operating revenues are squeezed, cities are really forced or placed in the position of having to either cut services, and often this means jobs, or raise taxes in order to cover these reductions in revenue. Okay, next page. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but in this report, I did highlight how some of the specific impacts this was having on Alberta's largest cities. There's a one-page fact sheet for both of them. While there are slight differences between the two, at the end of the day, both of these large cities are looking at receiving about $400 million less than they were originally anticipating by 2024. And then beginning in 2024, they're set to receive $33 million less per year than they were originally anticipating under the city charter's framework. Okay. Next slide, thanks. So when discussing these cuts with municipal leaders across Alberta, there were really 5 key themes or trends that were continuously raised. Okay. The first was that the province really acted more like parents to municipalities over partners. So this has always really been, of course, there's always been a hierarchical relationship between municipalities and the province. And of course, there exists an institutional power imbalance between the two. But that being said, interviewees really noted that there has been quite a deterioration of collaboration and consultation over the past few years. A number of interviewees intimated that the province doesn't really seem to get it, right? Meaning that they don't really understand what municipalities do and don't see why it's so critical to engage with municipalities and collaborate with them in order to achieve shared goals. I mean, one side note I will raise is that there is hope that with the new Minister of Municipal Affairs, Rick McIver, he's a former city councilor in Calgary, so he is more familiar with the challenges cities are facing. And so there was some hope expressed among interviewees that there was some kind of cautious optimism on that front. But ultimately, like, I will note that this lack of a real partnership mentality really seemed to bother these municipal leaders even more so than the decreases in funding they were seeing. So many acknowledge that we're in tough economic times. I mean, hopefully we're on the upswing now, but that now more than ever, and I mean, especially during a pandemic, we need these two levels of government, municipal, provincial, to be coming together to the table, to be seen eye to eye, to be finding creative solutions to our problems. And this just really isn't happening right now. Another thing that came up often in these interviews was that the province has oftentimes failed to fully leverage federal funding. So to access federal funding geared towards municipalities, most programs require that municipalities, the province, and the federal government each pay 1/3 of the project cost. So a third, a third, a third. In my research, a reoccurring theme was that many federal funding opportunities for municipalities, from affordable housing to transit, to, I mean, until recently, rural broadband, have been delayed or unsuccessful due to a lack of provincial partnership and commitment. And I mean, this is especially perhaps ironic considering the ever-present, rhetoric that Alberta isn't getting a fair deal from Ottawa. Okay. A third point that I wanted to raise was that throughout these interviews, I was constantly told that, delayed and inconsistent funding does more than just push back how long it's going to take to do a project, right? So in many cases, it can force cities to absorb really high debt financing and administrative costs, which are invariably set by the province, which are invariably paid for by you, the taxpayers. It's also interesting to note that the province actually requires municipalities to set 3-year operating and 5-year capital budgets. And then when these transfers to municipalities are changed, as has been the norm as of late, cities are finding themselves scrambling, having to redo their budget, something that takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. Okay. The fourth point is what I call the municipal ripple effect. And that's just to say that provincial decisions in other policy areas invariably impact municipalities somehow, right? Whether it's the pandemic response, cuts to post-secondary institutions, the public workforce, all of these decisions, safe consumption sites, addiction, all of these impact local communities and local economies, right? All decisions are ultimately local. I'm a big adherent to that. Okay, and then finally, interviewees really drove home the need to rethink municipal finances and municipal provincial relations and give municipalities the tools they need to properly invest in the future of their communities, particularly in this day and age where people can work really from anywhere, right? Cities are competing globally for talent, and a real partnership between cities and the province is needed, if nothing, then for the continued economic prosperity of the province. All right, so next slide, last slide. So why does this matter? I mean, of course, when we published this report in September, our main goal was to arm voters with information that would help them cast their ballots more effectively and mindfully. We hope voters would consider things like the complexity of the dynamics involved and the feasibility of some local candidates' platforms. So as we're all aware, candidates can make big promises about what they'll do, about what taxes they'll cut, about what efficiencies they may find. But it's critical for voters to know that some of these decisions simply aren't theirs alone to make, right? That actions made by the province impact the feasibility of these positions. So, I mean, this is all well and good, but as we know, the elections passed. So why is this something we should be thinking about right now? Really, I want to stress here the importance of advocacy and advocating for our cities and municipalities, and the critical impact that provincial policy has on our municipalities and by extension, our very quality of life. So I really hope to have shown in this report the importance of investing in our communities and the impact that strong municipal services have on our day-to-day lives and our future prosperity. You know, the decisions we make now are not going to only help us attract talent and compete globally, but not making investments now will likely lead to increased costs for our children down the road. So we need to be mindful of this and be aware of the decisions being taken that affect at the provincial level that affect our municipalities. You know, this is not some secondary, unimportant policy area. It's in fact central to so many parts of our day-to-day lives. And finally, I really hope to have demonstrated in this report that municipal issues are not just the concern of the municipal voter, but the provincial voter as well, right? So a provincial election will be coming in the next 2 years. Demand more of your provincial MLAs when it comes to our cities. If you show to them that it's a priority for you, it will become a priority for them. So I think that's it for now, but I thank you for your time and I look forward to our discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much. I've put up your last slide there with the name of the report, and thank you so much for that presentation. Excellent, really interesting. I'll go right to the Q&A. Leona Jacobs, read tax exemption status for nursing homes. Clarification. Does this include assisted living facilities and long-term care facilities?
Oh, I'm not exactly sure what the specific, I want to say yes. Sorry, I'm not entirely positive of like the specific definitions and how that would be delineated. In my interview, I was told there's 18, so that 18 large ones. So I'm not sure if that would encapsulate all assisted living. I would imagine so, but please don't quote me on that.
Okay. Our next question comes from Knut Peterson, who also says it's nice to see a Peterson making a SACPA speaker list. Are there any indications that the current increase in oil and gas prices, and then in brackets, Alberta's boom and bust economy, will benefit municipalities?
Well, I mean, if history is any indication, it will benefit municipalities by increasing growth in the province, and it should theoretically make the province more willing to increase its transfers and revisit some of these things. It really speaks, though, to the, I mean, as an Albertan, all of us, we're no stranger to this kind of boom bust cycle, and I think that municipalities are impacted similar to other policy issue areas as well. So while I think this is potentially positive for municipalities, it brings to light just how our need to really rethink having an economy and having municipalities financed so heavily by provincial discretion and by our reliance on many of these revenue sources that are really beyond our control. And we might choose to look for a more sustainable approach going forward.
Our next question comes from Ian Hurdle. Nursing homes, any tax differences for non-profit versus for-profit?
Ooh, I don't know about that. Sorry, you'll have to I would just speculate that they're like provincially funded nursing homes, but I really don't know. That would be interesting to know.
Leona Jacobs, I think you said that Calgary/Edmonton were consulted with the charter proposal, and then in brackets, effective 2022. Were Calgary and Edmonton at least consulted prior to these changes by the current government?
I did not receive that impression from my interviews, that there was not much of a sustained discussion, if anything, of the changes that were proposed. You know, the city charter's fiscal framework took a lot of work and time and manpowers by not just Calgary and Edmonton, but municipal leaders across the province. I mean, Calgary and Edmonton are a central component of it, but it also included, of course, a plan for the rest of Alberta's municipalities. I think many of them were taken somewhat aback about, or the people that worked on developing this framework, by having it kind of shelved is the best way, I think, to frame it. It wasn't entirely ripped up, but it's essentially not in effect.
Beth Mundell, is there any movement to tax for-profit senior facilities versus non-for-profit?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, this raises a good question. So as I mentioned, I don't know like the specifics of the nursing home assisted living. Like I haven't looked that closely at this policy. But I mean, that's a really interesting question, right? I would be really curious to know if both nonprofit, for-profit are subjected to the same rules, and then following whatever that response is, whether or not that's appropriate. So you raise a good question to which I don't have an answer.
Laura Schultz, what recourses do municipalities have to change funding model?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for bringing it up. So municipalities themselves do not really have any like legal recourse to introduce their own revenue source or their own tax or their own, you know, in US cities you often see cities themselves will be able to implement their own sales tax. So this is something we can't do in Canada. Everything basically is done at the provincial level when it comes to changing those municipal revenue tools. But this raises, I mean, an important part of this discussion, which is many of the people I spoke to really highlighted the fact, and this is something, again, I didn't touch on in this presentation, but of course, when you pay property tax, most of this money, well, all of the money does go to the city, but usually around a third of those taxes are then transferred on to the province as the quote unquote educational portion of the property tax, right? So many of the people I interviewed with, and I mean, Annalise, if you want to go back to that slide that has Calgary and Edmonton on it, many of the people I spoke with said, hey, you know what? Just let us keep that, all of the property. Yeah, slide 7. Just let us keep all of the property tax, right? Let us keep the residential, let us keep this educational, that, and then that more than covers the transfers that we receive in return, right? And that way we can make the decisions about what's best for our city, what needs and priorities we have, instead of being subject to this like fluctuating provincial discretion, and provincial programs and administrative costs and whatnot, instead of us sending you, so in Calgary's case, this is almost 4 billion, instead of us sending you 4 billion in education property tax, and then you sending us 3.5 billion back in the forms of transfers, let's just let us keep the property tax, you keep the transfers, and that would be a lot more of a reliable revenue source for cities. So this is one idea that was raised quite often throughout the interviews.
Right. Mark Goodall, the city determines how much tax I have to pay, not the other way around. What are the legal implications of how the province decides on its own how much tax it will pay to the city for their facilities?
Sorry, do you mind repeating it? I'm sorry, it was just a long one.
Yeah. So the city determines how much tax I have to pay, not the other way around. So what are the legal implications of how the province decides on its own how much tax it will pay to the city for their facilities?
Yeah, so again, it goes back to the same point that when it comes to legal implications, it's the province that sets the rules when it comes to municipalities, right? So the province can really do whatever it wants when it comes to how much money it transfers to cities and what taxes it does and doesn't pay. You know, these cities do have, as well as the province, models in place that estimate, you know, given, historical tax rates and assessed property values, what should be paid, I guess, to cover any property tax. But really, cities don't have, at least as far as I understand, much of a legal recourse at all. And this is part of the broader challenge, right? Because you can't just, if this was you, the property taxpayer, and you just told the city, well, I actually only want to pay 2/3 of my property tax this year. Here you go. I mean, the city's not going to let that fly, but unfortunately, the province is not on equal footing with you or I.
So just out of ignorance, what does the city do when I only pay a third of my property tax?
Like, as a taxpayer?
Yeah, what do they do? Like, just out of pure ignorance on my part, what happens?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, but I imagine they would take you to court and eventually, yeah. I'm not sure down that legal rabbit hole, but the city would have a lot more, legal tools on its hand. I mean, eventually. I mean, this does happen, right? There are properties that are kind of abandoned, and eventually the city just kind of takes them over and demolishes them, or what have you. But it is quite a lengthy process.
Okay. Terry Shillington, how well did the previous, and then in brackets NDP government, understand partnership, and that's capitalized, with the municipalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I heard, it was interesting. I met with quite a few people from all types of different municipalities across Alberta, some, much more conservative areas than others. But kind of across the board, I heard that when the NDP was first elected, it took them on the municipal file about a year or two to kind of like find their feet, right? And to kind of figure things out. But once that happened, um, there was quite a strong sense of partnership, or at least responsiveness, I guess you could say is the right word, to municipalities. So although it did take a little bit of time, I think I mean, there was generally a large consensus that it was improved or better than it currently is. But it does take some time, and I mean, I think I actually met for this research with the NDP Municipal Affairs critic, Joe Cece, and he was mentioning, out of everybody in all the elected officials in the legislature, only, he wasn't sure if it's 2 or 3, have that municipal local council background, right? Him and Rick McIver, who's now the minister. So when you have so many elected provincial representatives that haven't been on a local council or are just as fluent with the way that municipalities work, it's easier to kind of just see them as secondary or just one more stakeholder, instead of a partner. So it is interesting that there have been certain themes that you've been able to like pull through all of the administrations, but you definitely did see quite a few differences as well.
Knut Peterson, are municipalities allowed to run money-generating businesses such as solar farms or renewable energy projects, etc.?
Yeah, yes. I'm not sure if it depends in terms of like the size of municipality, or they might need to have certain legal structures in place. But yes, like for instance, you look at I'm not sure how it's done in Lethbridge, but Calgary's Power Utility NMAX. So this is a wholly owned subsidiary, but it does profit, and these revenues are used either invested for, as we would invest in savings, or they're funneled into like the city's general fund as well. Especially in the States, you see lots of cities rely really, really heavily on their utility providers for revenue component, especially electricity. I don't think water is the same. I'm trying to think. I'm not exactly sure, but it would be something to think more about in terms of their ability to raise revenue. So I'm thinking of Calgary and Edmonton and their new sports facilities that the city is paying for. You can get into some kind of complex land financing agreements that basically, when the value of the asset increases, the land surrounding it will increase in value. That will then go towards property taxes that will allow for future investment. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure if cities are able, or maybe this is just something that cities are reticent to do, because definitely here in Alberta, if you're undertaking a for-profit venture, there's general consensus that this shouldn't really be in the public domain, right? Like, why not just have a private company do that, unless there are those really inherent public benefits?
Next question comes from Ian Hurdle. What level of funding has the city and the province lost out by not participating in the tripartite process?
I don't know total amounts, but I can give a few anecdotes. So in Edmonton, the federal government recently, in the last few years, announced this now $2 billion rapid housing initiative. So Edmonton had put, and this isn't even a third, Edmonton had put money aside to build these units, supported assisted living. I forget I want to say 160 units, but that might need to be confirmed. The federal money was lined up from this fund, and the city was asking the province essentially for, I believe it was $6 million. It wasn't a lot, but just for the operating expenses of this facility. And that wasn't included in the 2021 budget, which I know really kind of stun Edmonton a bit, because they had put forth a lot of money commitments and had gotten all those kind of federal agreements in place. So that's not advancing. And I mean, these federal when you look at this, say, federal rapid housing initiative, $2 billion, it's a lot of money, but it's still a finite amount, right? We're still, quote unquote, competing with housing projects in Eastern Canada and BC. And if we don't have all of our ducks in a row and kind of everyone on the same side, it makes it a lot more difficult for us to build those investments here in Alberta and, quote unquote, get our share, right, of these federal dollars.
Is it also hindered by party politics?
Well, I don't know, I would say it's hindered, but it's probably not bolstered or, like, encouraged along. I mean, the recent discussions we've been having with childcare, it's kind of outside of this municipal realm, although some would argue otherwise. But yeah, it is tricky. And I will say that this doesn't need to be a partisan issue, right? So we've really seen across Canada a very sustained increase in infrastructure funding, particularly for cities, beginning around 2004 and Paul Martin, but even throughout the Harper era, they made a lot of advances in terms of, like, making the gas tax permanent, which is an important federal transfer program for cities, and initiating a few other large infrastructure programs. So it doesn't need to be an impediment, but I mean, sometimes the reality on the ground is different. And I will say that I think that I didn't focus on that so much in this report, but I think this is something you see in Canada that really kind of slows down how fast projects can advance, and this back and forth about getting all three parties on side. It's great that we can get investment from other levels of government. Many cities in the States don't have that same luxury, but it kind of draws out the process and alters the dynamic a bit.
Our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. Based on the referendum on equalization, it appears Albertans are unaware of the unleveraged federal funding. Any thoughts on how to increase awareness among Albertans?
I mean, spread this webinar. It's tricky. Like, ultimately, the more people we can talk to that to raise awareness about these very complex dynamics and the way that funding doesn't just flow one way, right, from the province to the federal government. It comes and goes, and from the municipalities to the province as well. I know some municipal politicians were kind of joking. Well, I don't know, we're joking. They might have been talking earnestly, but suggesting when the province put forth this referendum on equalization, they should also put forth an question on the referendum about cities getting its fair share, right, from the province. I think we just try to really have those conversations, and I think cities themselves are also trying to raise awareness and bring clarity to taxpayers and to their residents about, for instance, where your property tax dollars go, right? And different things like that. It's tricky. Like, I mean, it's kind of a $1 million question, but unfortunately, I think the equalization question on the referendum was like very loaded, and it wasn't necessarily I think it meant many things to many people, and shaping that whole driving narrative is a whole other kind of bottle of wax.
Our next question comes from Mary Shillington. In preparing your report, did you interview provincial cabinet ministers?
No, so I reached out to Minister McIver's office, and they considered it, but never ended up getting back to me. It's very difficult. I think one thing that maybe we could all agree on is that municipal affairs is kind of given like the short shrift, or whatever the saying is, right? Like, it's not considered one of those core ministries like energy or health or education that receives the glamour. We don't often think about municipal affairs. Most people don't know who the municipal affairs minister is. And I think it's often this way in government too, that it's not really given the importance that it deserves. So I did reach out to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. I didn't reach out to other cabinet ministers, although in my other research I have met with various other people in the Alberta government. But no, it definitely would have added value to the report, and I'd be curious in getting more of their perspective as well on the rationale behind some of these changes.
Our last question comes from Knut Peterson. Have you found any evidence that particular political leanings in municipalities negatively or positively affect its relationship to the government in power?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to attribute it directly to partisanship, but often in my interviews, mayors and city councilors of smaller communities, which tend to be more rural communities, would have stronger relationships with their elected officials. And this is often because in smaller communities, they're just more accessible, right? You know who they are, they live in your community, and you often have those kind of like political ties in place beforehand. But then, so I wouldn't want to draw a false equivalency between the fact that rural municipalities and smaller municipalities are more likely to be conservative, and then their MLAs are more likely to be conservative. It was really, I mean, one interesting maybe anecdote I'll share is, so the city of Calgary, the council always tries to host these like Calgary get-togethers with the Calgary MLAs in that city. And one city councilor I was talking to was like, the last time we did this, there's like 24 MLAs in the city. Maybe more, actually, maybe just 24 UCP or what have you, but only 3 people showed up to this like wine and cheese that they put on. And he was like, how can we really, like, we should be advocating for Calgary like as a team, right? But oftentimes lots of these MLAs don't really see Calgary like as a city and the success of that. And I mean, maybe it's true in Lethbridge or kind of mid-sized cities as well. It's harder in bigger cities, which tend to elect more NDP, but also there seems to be more of kind of a disconnect between those lived relationships that you have in the more rural, more traditionally conservative parts of the province. So no clear answer, but lots to speculate on.
Excellent. That's it for the queue. Lots of thank yous. Beth Mandel, Laura Schultz, Knut Peterson. Really informative information and answer. Many thanks. Jacqueline, thank you for sharing your research. I've learned a great deal. Thank you. And so it goes. Before we end the session today, do you have a take-home message for our viewers, please?
I mean, the main thing I really am trying always to say is that cities matter, municipalities matter, right? We need to be making investments in our city to be building the prosperous, vibrant, inclusive cities of tomorrow. And as much as this is a local issue with your local councils, with your mayor, this is also a provincial issue as well. So think about your city when you're thinking about provincial policy and vice versa, and advocate for your city and get engaged on that front.
Lovely. On behalf of SACPA, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a fantastic talk and we learned a lot. And for our viewers, I hope you'll join us next week with Alvin Mills, Kindness to Others, a perspective on the addiction crisis in Lethbridge. And we'll see you next week.